It's a longer passage, so I won't read the whole thing to start with. It's on 1062 in your Bible, if you want to follow along there. And I will read it all, but I'll read it all in just little bits coming up. There are varying philosophies on child rearing, many different ways of thinking about it and doing it. However, I think a case could be made that when it comes right down to it, there's really just two methods or two ways or two schools of thought when it comes to child rearing. And I'm just going to condense all of them down into these two ways, and we'll say one is the old way and the other is the new way. Now, I'm speaking in broad terms, but I think it helps us to wrap our minds around it. And I'm aware there are a lot of people that would tell you that mankind has been around for hundreds of thousands of years, but I'm not one of those. I don't think that. But whatever the case is, we're going to focus on the recorded history that we have and think of the biblical account, which lands at about 6,000 years. And when we think of those 6,000 years, the old way of child rearing lasted for about 5,950 of those years, and the new way, about 50. Now, more and more people today have grown up in the new way. Of course, not all old way parents were good and kind and did things like they should have all the time. They have that in common with the new way parents because they're people. But new way parenting wants us to focus on understanding. It goes by descriptions like grace-based parenting. It involves a lot of negotiations. Now, I wouldn't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying. I was raised under the old way, and I actually tried my hand at negotiating quite a few times. But in the new way, it's the parents that are doing the negotiating. Now, Johnny, if you'll do this, then I'll do this. If you'll just not do that anymore, then I'll do this. If you'll this, then we'll this. That kind of negotiating. I could make a case, or I would make the case, that a child raised in the old way might have a leg up in understanding God. But even a group of people like ancient Israel, who were raised in the old way, had trouble at times in their relationship with God. And where they did, I would make the case that they were living in the future. They were already expecting God to sort of be a new way parent. The book of Isaiah opens with a theme. And the theme is first judgment, then salvation. First judgment and then salvation. This passage that we're looking at tonight will elaborate on that. Tonight's passage is, I'm sorry to tell you, just the judgment part. The salvation part will be later, but tonight it's just the judgment part. Many people in those days looked forward to the day of the Lord. Lots of the prophets talked about the day of the Lord. And the day of the Lord, when he would come and he would judge the nations. When he would come and God would finally say, enough is enough, and just take care of business. They were looking forward to this. But the thing is, even though that kind of thinking, that sort of idea kind of resonates with us, you might look at the news on a given day and think, boy, Jesus needs to come back here and straighten this out. But see, someday God really is going to call it quits, and someday Jesus really will return and judgment really will issue forth. But see, in Isaiah's day, Isaiah himself and other prophets said to the people that were longing for that day, hold on, not so fast. Because the judgment will come. It will come first, but it will first come on Israel. And that wasn't a message that they were really too keen on. We think about the gospel days, the time where Jesus was around. Think about the attitudes that Jesus encountered as he preached. If Jesus would have spent a lot of time preaching judgment on Rome, the Sanhedrin probably would have willingly followed him. But he had the nerve to preach that it was actually Israel that needed reforms. He had the nerve to tell the religious leaders and other Jews, it's you guys. Don't worry about them. We need to get your house in order. And as we look at the passage tonight, we'll see some more of that. Now we're going to break this up into kind of a three-part outline. And even though I've put all the blanks for the outline there at the top, I'll give it to you one piece at a time. So the first one I'll give you now, and then the others I'll give you in a little bit. The first one is Isaiah in the grip of strong emotions. And that's going to take us from verse 6 to 11. Isaiah in the grip of strong emotions. Isaiah writes, "For you have forsaken your people, the house of Jacob, because they are filled with eastern ways. They are soothsayers like the Philistines, and they are pleased with the children of foreigners. Their land is also full of silver and gold, and there is no end to their treasures. Their land is also full of horses, and there is no end to their chariots. Their land is also full of idols. They worship the work of their own hands, that which their own fingers have made. People bow down, and each man humbles himself. Therefore, do not forgive them. Enter into the rock and hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty. The lofty looks of man shall be humbled. The haughtiness of men shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day." Now, there were a lot of geopolitical enemies that Israel, and again, I mentioned this before, even though Israel at this time is a northern kingdom, Judah, where Isaiah lives, is the southern kingdom. Usually, if he says Israel, he means the group of people, God's people, okay? They had a number of geopolitical enemies they could have pointed at. Syria was a problem. Ethiopia at times was a problem. Egypt was a problem. Assyria was a coming problem. Babylon hadn't come on the scene yet, but they would be a problem. There were all these different Philistines. There were all these different groups, and they could have made a case that all of them were idolaters and all of them deserved for God to take a close look at them. They could have made that case, and probably at times they did, and probably there were times when some of them said, "God, you need to look at them. I mean, don't look here, look over there. See what they're doing, see how bad they are, see the mess they're in." That's where the judgment needs to fall. But see, that's not the way it goes. And Isaiah's got, like I said, got some bad news. Well, judgment's going to happen, but the judgment's going to start here. And it sounds almost like Isaiah's blaming God for the problem. He says, you have forsaken your people. I think the NIV says you've abandoned your people. Look around. It seemed like God had forsaken or abandoned them. It seemed like God had just left them in the lurch. In that kind of a scenario, what could they do? We would like healing in our land, but if God has forsaken us, what possible hope is there? What would it look like if God really had forsaken them or abandoned them? Abandoned in the sense of just stepping back and giving them what they want. It's still this way on a macro level and on a micro level. God is not going to force people to obey him. And sometimes when a person or a nation consistently works against God and they consistently don't want what he wants, sometimes that abandonment will just look like, well, it might look like abandonment, but really what it is God just saying, okay. When my kids were little, mostly my boys, but sometimes the girls, if we were walking somewhere and I had their hand, but they didn't want to hold my hand, they would start leaning away. And I would talk about them being like a street protester. And they're just like putting all their weight against. And I would try to encourage them not to do that. Often, though, if they wouldn't quit, I'd just let go. And then I'd pick them up, because that would make them fall. They would fall because they were working so hard to get away from me. Then I'd pick them up and I'd say, don't do that. Eventually, God's not even going to do the picking up. Because if you want to be away from God that much, eventually he's going to just let go and say, okay, if that's the way you want it. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people recite their philosophy of causality and say, something will happen, and they'll say, well, I like to say everything happens for a reason. Well, I think for a Christian, there are better ways of looking at the world. Isaiah might have heard that kind of a statement and responded, well, yes, these things have happened for a reason, and that reason is that you've lived your life with no regard for God. That's why this happened. It's still true. We're going to be disappointed if we think that we can live with no regard for God and no regard for the things he has said we should do and the things that he has said we should not do. If we think we can live that way and then expect God to come along and just clean up all our messes all the time, you could be disappointed. Because he's not going to do that. In Isaiah's day, I think the people were expecting exactly that. They were living like the nations around them, but expecting that God would never, never forget, we're your children. But what did Isaiah say? They are filled, you've forsaken your people, Lord, because they are filled with eastern ways. Not that the east is the definition of all things evil, but west of Israel is the Mediterranean Sea. So the western people, I guess, would be Americans eventually, and they weren't around then. So the eastern, they were living like the other people. They're soothsayers like the Philistines. They're pleased with the children of foreigners. Some today would say, oh, that was good. No, it wasn't good. And not because they were foreigners, but because they weren't following God. They were enamored of the ways of other people that weren't following God. They were counting on silver and gold and things like that. There was a king, King Ahaz, who had visited a neighboring kingdom, and he decided that he quite liked the way they were worshiping. They weren't worshiping God, but he thought what they had going, their system of worship was pretty cool, so he built a foreign altar. He built an altar to that other god in the temple. God doesn't like that. God takes a dim view of that. When we put something in the place of worship that God should have, that's idolatry. Whether we do it physically like that king did, or whether we do it just sort of metaphorically in our heart. I make other things more important than God. That God doesn't like that. If they were acting like the Philistines, why would they assume that God wouldn't treat them like Philistines? They would have said, the average person would have said, Philistines? Oh my goodness, God doesn't like them. He doesn't like them. But then they were acting like the Philistines, and somehow, well, it's okay when we do it. There are still people like that today that call themselves Christians. And they love making up lists of all the things Christians can do and don't have to do. Christians can cuss. Christians can drink. Christians can smoke. Christians don't have to go to church. Christians don't have to do this. Christians don't have to do that. And pretty soon, you're living like the Philistines and expecting that God's going to treat you different than he treats the Philistines because he likes you better. It don't work that way. It didn't work for them. It won't work today. During the reigns of Uzziah, that was a king that had, right at the beginning of Isaiah's time as a prophet, Uzziah, and Jeroboam II, he was a northern king. The two kingdoms, Judah and Israel, had experienced great growth and prosperity. They had economic prosperity and they had military might. That was some of their stronger days as kingdoms in that period of time, say like after Solomon. But sadly, there were also multiple systems of worship and multiple objects of worship. See, when we abandon God, we don't worship nothing. When we decide we're not going to worship God, we might say we're not going to worship, but it's not the truth. If we don't worship God, we're not worshiping nothing. We generally end up in self-satisfaction and self-worship, if nothing else. Verse 9 says, people bow down, each man humbles himself, therefore do not forgive them. Well, that seems harsh. They'll be humbled, so why would Isaiah say, pray to God not to forgive them? Well, I think what he's saying is, God, don't treat them as though you were a new way kind of parent. Don't just overlook their sin. That kind of person doesn't deserve a pass. That kind of pride can't be overlooked. It has to be dealt with. The new way kind of parent doesn't like punishment because it just seems punitive to them, which it kind of is. That's sort of the point. But God, see, is not a new way kind of parent. God is an old way kind of parent. When God is seen, the arrogant suddenly look for places to hide. Verse 10, enter into the rock, hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord. When my kids were little, I made somewhat, it wasn't like all the time, but I made somewhat regular trips to the hardware store, and I would buy 1/4-inch dowel rods that were 4 feet long. And I'd cut them in about 3 pieces. And I would put one of these dowel rods, 1/4-inch, I'd put one of them, they're about that long, I put them in the door jamb, up on the molding of the door jamb. Like every place in the house, there was one. And then, I didn't have to use them much, but when something started happening, if the kids noticed that I started looking up there, then there was scurrying and adjustments made. Isaiah describes a more insistent scurrying here. They notice that God has noticed them and what they're doing, and they're running, they're entering into the rock, hiding in the dust. They're trying to get away from what God is doing. The problem is pride, and ultimately pride leads to a confrontation with God. When we see God for who He is, we'll more accurately see ourselves for what we are. And when that happens, our pride gets undone. We can think, we can think highly of ourselves in certain situations. A person that says, well, you shouldn't compare yourself to other people. Well, that's scriptural. But if you want to feel good, compare yourself to other people. You just got to be careful who you're comparing yourself to. If you're good at comparing yourself to other people, you'll feel great because you'll always compare yourself to people that you consider far beneath you. So I may not be much, but compared to that guy, I'm okay. I'm not the nicest guy in the world, but compared to that guy, I'm not the hardest working guy, but compared to that guy, you just got to be careful who you're comparing to. But see, when we see God, all the comparisons come to a screeching halt because we're like, whoa, okay, I got nothing. There's nothing worth comparing now because I see myself more accurately because I see God more accurately. Our second headline, or our second outline point is verses 12 to 18, and this contrast things with God and illustrate His soul glory. It contrasts things with God and shows His soul glory. Verse 12, for the day of the Lord of hosts shall come upon everything proud and lofty, upon everything lifted up, and it shall be brought low, upon all the cedars of Lebanon that are high and lifted up, and upon all the oaks of Bashan, upon all the high mountains, and upon all the hills that are lifted up, upon every high tower, and upon every fortified wall, upon all the ships of Tarshish, upon all the beautiful sloops. The loftiness of man shall be bowed down, and the haughtiness of men shall be brought low. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day, but the idols He shall utterly abolish. So I mentioned before, a common theme for the Old Testament prophets was the day of the Lord. This is going to be a day of judgment for the whole world. Israel seemed to be pretty consistent in overlooking the part that they were part of the world and that God would be looking at them first. If you were raised by an old way kind of parent, you might remember a time when you were misbehaving in some way with your buddies, and then your dad or your mom shows up and yells at the other guys, and they go scurrying off, and you have this brief moment of feeling a little smug as you walk away with your dad, up until the point then when your dad turns his attention to you. And then you find out, well, he yelled at them, but now he's not just going to yell at you. Now he's got more to give you than just a voice. That's what Israel was facing. Israel had grown proud, and as they did that, they transferred their trust from God to other things. As their pride increased, they transferred their trust in God to other things. Again, that's called idolatry. And they had a lot of experience with this. God had delivered them from Egypt. He had fed and He'd watered them on the way to the promised land. And it was all really miraculous. Yet when they got to the promised land and they sent the spies in, well, why did they do that, by the way? Send the spies in. Why? God was with them. They followed the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire to get there. God who'd told Moses was still there. They told the God that said to Moses, look, just hit the rock with your staff and water gushes out for everybody. We're hungry. We've got nothing to eat. And manna falls every day. God was feeding them. We're tired of the manna, and so there's quail. On and on, miracle, 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 miracle. They get to the promised land and they got to send spies in. They got there, they transferred their trust in God to trusting in themselves, and they bombed. They sent the spies in, and the spies said, you know what? We look little compared to them. We don't think we can do it. And the majority ruled and said, oh, we agree with you. In Isaiah's day, they had transferred their trust in God to other things. But everything the people had trusted in was going to let them down and would be brought down itself. You look at the list, starting with verse 12 there. Actually, it starts in verse 13. The cedars of Lebanon, the oaks of Bashan. These are symbols of the ability to build, and symbols of strength, and symbols of fertility and virility, and all this is going to be brought down. The high mountains. You might remember a couple of weeks ago, I said that people in that day felt like the mountains were connecting points with God, or gods, not always the real God. Okay? They're going to be brought down. Every high tower, they built these towers, fortified walls, going to be brought down. We trusted in ships of merchandise, of consumerism. It's going to be brought down. The loftiness of man, going to be bowed down. The haughtiness of man brought low. So the proudest people are going to be brought down. And the idols they had made, God will utterly abolish. Sometimes I feel like we mistakenly get the idea that there is a cosmic battle going on, and it's nip and tuck. You know, God and the other gods. God with the capital G and the little g gods. The little g gods, if they're anything, are demons. There is no nip and tuck, back and forth. It's anybody's ball game war going on with the demons and with God. He doesn't need to do that. The gods of Egypt did real things. Remember when Moses went in there and he's going to, he puts down his staff and it turns into a snake? Their guys did the same thing. He made frogs, and they made frogs, I think it was. More than once, they did things too. Well, how? By demons. Their gods could do things. They were demons, right? But when it all came down to it, God sent a messenger boy one night and just killed all the firstborn. Just one of his messengers. As though, like, the UPS driver gets out of the truck and just goes and wipes everybody out. If we got in a war, heaven forbid, if we got in a war with China, and they're massing their armies and their navies and everything, and like a helicopter flies over China, and the hatch comes open, and a guy in a brown suit rappels down the line. He's got his UPS uniform on. And he just takes care of everybody. And then President Trump, or whoever would be the president at the time, calls up their president and said, "Now listen, that's just one of my guys. I got more. I got a lot more." God's not worried about who's going to win. He's in charge. He made those demons. However much strength they've got now is less than when he made them. They're fallen. He made them as good as they ever were. He made them that way, and they were still infinitely below him. I might have to worry about what a demon might do if I was in some sort of head-to-head matchup, but God doesn't. He doesn't have to worry about that. None of those things they trusted in were going to protect them from their enemies, and none of them were going to protect them from God. The last section is verses 19 to 22, and it's the reaction of man under judgment. The reaction of man under judgment. So we look at verse 19. What are they going to do? They shall go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty, when he arises to shake the earth mightily. In that day, a man will cast away his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which they made, each for himself to worship, to the moles and bats, to go into the clefts of the rocks and into the crags of the rugged rocks from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty, when he arises to shake the earth mightily. Sever yourselves from such a man whose breath is in his nostrils. For of what account is he? Everybody, if you've lived very long, you may have known someone directly or you knew of someone that would say silly things like, well, I'm just going to do what I want. And if God doesn't like it, he can just strike me down where I stand. And then when God doesn't strike them down where they stand, they feel like they've won some victory. See, God certainly could do that. He could do that. But generally, that's not the way God acts. Not because he's powerless. Not because he lacks the will to make himself known. It's just not the way he usually acts. Because he doesn't have to. If God ever just steps back, the world itself is going to close in on us. Because we may not realize this, God is active in our lives. He's active in everybody's life. If he wasn't, you wouldn't be able to take another breath. God is often just keeping things back. But if he just steps back, okay, have it your way. If that happens, we're in trouble. The Assyrians didn't overpower God to destroy Israel. The Babylonians that were going to come in the future, as far as when Isaiah wrote this, the Babylonians, they didn't pull one over on God to take Judah away captive. No, they were used by God. There are too many times these days, I think, when things happen, and there are preachers willing to speak for God and say, well, that has nothing to do with God. You know, something bad happens, and someone might say, I feel like this is a judgment. There's going to be a line of people to jump up and say, oh, no, God would never do that. God would never do that. Okay, God's done that kind of thing a lot. Read the Bible. He's done that thing a lot. What do you mean he would never do that? Every bad thing that happens is an active judgment of God. I'm not saying that. But sometimes it is that. It actually might have a lot to do with it. But see, if you look at God as a new way kind of parent, as a new way kind of father, then you might think that God would never punish his children. He'll always just look for ways of forgiving. He'll negotiate with them. Maybe he'll put them in timeout. Maybe he'll have a little talk with them and say, you know, you should not. Is that the way we should act? Is that the way is that what? No, if you think that's what God's going to be like, you're probably going to be disappointed and surprised. You don't get that from Scripture. Now again, that's not to say that that we swing that all the way on the other side and paint the angry picture, the picture of an angry God, the get off my lawn guy. No, not that either. But there's times when punishment does happen. And God is going to act in a way that would be a lot more characteristic of the old way. The people that Isaiah was preaching to here, they were going to come to the end of themselves. And when they do, they're going to be left looking for a hole to crawl into. John wrote about that in the book of Revelation. They're just begging the rocks to fall on them so they get away from God. I don't want God to look at me. Every once in a while. At a few occasions where there was a kid at school, like, stop looking at me. That's going to be what it is with God someday. We won't want that. They're going to realize the idols that they had transferred their trust to were powerless to save them. And they're really good for nothing. And they're just going to throw them out where the vermin live. That's what it was talking about there, where it said, They'll cast away their idols of silver and gold, which they made to worship, to the moles and the bats. I'm just going to throw them where the moles and the bats live, because they're not worth anything. They don't do anything. There will be horrified running and hiding. Isaiah suggests that if they had transferred their faith to some man, that would be a good time for them to transfer it back to where it belonged, onto God. Some man whose breath is in his nostrils, that guy just breathing just like you are, that guy that just puts his pants on one leg at a time like you do. If that's your trust, you're probably going to be disappointed. If your trust in the future in the eternal future, if you're trusting the eternal future of America is the next election, you're going to be disappointed. That's not to say we don't care about that. It's not to say we don't take part in that. But we do it knowing that God is where our trust is. We need to be reminded, when we think about these things, when we think about judgment for sure, that Jesus is not the nice God and the Father, the grumpy God. Jesus is not the new way kind of parent, and God is the old way kind of parent. Jesus is ready to say, come on, buddy, come on, buddy. And God the Father is getting his belt off. No, that's not the way that goes, see? Because Jesus said, Philip one day said, Jesus, show us what the Father's like. And Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Amen. And that works both ways. If Jesus, this is a little geometry for you tonight. If Jesus is just like the Father, then the Father is just like Jesus. It can't be otherwise. If Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, well, the Father could say, well, if you've seen me, you've seen Jesus. We don't think about that often enough, but that is the way that works. The lesson to be learned in this passage is that we keep our trust firmly in God, and we never assume that he doesn't really mean what he says. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, thank you for your word to us tonight. Thank you for your patience with us, but Lord, also that you have given us ample warnings in Scripture that we can see that you do mean what you say, and that there is a time coming. There's not an endless number of opportunities to come to you. There's not an endless number of opportunities to turn to you. Though we don't know what the number is, every one of us has a fixed number of breaths that we're going to take on this earth. Every one of us has a certain number of times our heart is going to beat. We don't know what it is, but there is a fixed number. And so we have to make our peace with you and live for you now, and not ever let anything get in the way of our trust in you. Help us not ever to transfer our trust to other things, other people, other systems, but help us to stay firmly trusting in you and know that you are a good parent. You're a good father. And a good father loves, and sometimes the love looks like punishment. And help us to trust you in those times and to learn what you want us to learn. And we ask it all in your name. Amen. Thanks for coming tonight.